Cold Control, a true war encounter. The train's brakes shrieked against frozen steel as Staff Sergeant Marcus Whitefeather Chen pressed his face to the frost-covered window. February wind cut through gaps in the cattle car's wooden slats, carrying the metallic scent of snow and something else, something that smelled like home cooking. It had been 18 days since his capture in the mountain valleys. 18 days of wondering if he'd ever see another sunrise. The door slid open with a grinding protest, and Chen squinted against the pale morning light. Enemy soldiers in thick winter coats gestured with their rifles, their breath forming small clouds in the sub-zero air. But what struck Chen wasn't their weapons or their foreign uniforms. It was the smell wafting from a nearby building. Coffee, real coffee, strong and bitter, mixed with the aroma of frying meat. "Move, move," one of the guards said in accented English, but his voice carried no particular malice. Chen had expected snarling enemies drunk on victory. These men looked tired, cold, and surprisingly young. As the prisoners shuffled through the camp gates, Chen caught sight of the guard towers and barbed wire he'd expected. But between the military structures stood civilian buildings, a small school, what looked like a local clinic, even a modest church spire visible beyond the fence. This wasn't the isolated death camp from his briefings. This was a place where people lived. In the processing building, a medic examined each prisoner with methodical efficiency. When he reached Chen, the man paused, studying the Chinese-American features that had earned Chen his sniper nickname. "You are the one they call Whitefeather?" the medic asked quietly in English. Chen's blood went cold. If they knew his reputation, if they knew about the Ruger precision rifle that had earned its nickname, Cold Control, for its performance in these very mountains. "I'm Staff Sergeant Chen. Serial number. Easy," the medic said, pressing a cup of hot coffee into Chen's hands. "We know you were the sniper in Sector 7. Good shooting. Very precise." The coffee was real, rich. Better than anything Chen had tasted in months of field rations. But as he drank, his mind reeled. This man, this enemy, was complimenting his marksmanship, the same marksmanship that had killed 17 of his countrymen at ranges between 800 and 300 meters just weeks ago. "Drink," the medic said simply. "You will need strength." Chen's hands trembled around the cup, and not from the cold. Everything about this place contradicted his training. These people weren't supposed to know good coffee from bad. They weren't supposed to treat prisoners with casual professionalism. They certainly weren't supposed to acknowledge military skill in their enemies. As he was led to the barracks, Chen passed a mess hall where the smell of cooking meat grew stronger. Through the windows, he could see prisoners and guards eating at separate tables, but eating nonetheless. Real food, hot food. His bunk assignment came with a thin blanket and a warning from the barracks leader, a fellow prisoner named Harrison, who'd been captured 3 months earlier. "Listen carefully," Harrison whispered as the guards moved away. "They'll try to break you with kindness. Don't trust it. Don't trust any of it. Remember who you are." But as Chen lay on his bunk that first night, listening to the sound of ordinary life beyond the fence, children playing, a radio playing familiar music, the distant rumble of what sounded like a factory rather than artillery, he found himself wondering what exactly he was supposed to remember. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man reconcile the enemy in his mind with the enemy offering him coffee? 2 weeks into his captivity, Chen had learned the rhythm of the camp. Morning roll call at 0600, followed by work details that seemed more like community service than prisoner labor. He'd been assigned to help repair winter damage to the local school's roof, work that brought him into daily contact with the town's children, who watched the prisoners with curiosity rather than fear. The camp commander, Colonel Erickson, conducted weekly inspections with the demeanor of a small-town mayor rather than a military despot. During Chen's second week, Erickson stopped at his bunk and spoke in careful English. You were at the Battle of Ridge 347, yes? Our intelligence reports suggest you prevented a major assault there. Chen said nothing, but Erickson continued. 17 confirmed hits, ranges exceeding 1,200 meters in sub-zero conditions. Your weapon must have been exceptionally well maintained. The comment hit Chen like a physical blow. These people had studied his engagement with professional interest, the way one marksman might analyze another's technique. There was no hatred in Erickson's voice, only what sounded like genuine military respect. Your shooting journal was recovered from your position, Erickson added quietly. Remarkable attention to atmospheric variables. We have ballistics experts who would find your notes quite educational. That evening, Harrison found Chen staring at his supper, a bowl of thick beef stew that would have been a luxury even before his deployment. You're starting to look at them different, Harrison said, his voice sharp with warning. I can see it in your eyes. They're still the enemy, Chen. They killed Peterson. They killed Morrison. Don't you forget that? I know what they are, Chen replied, but the words felt hollow. The guard who'd served his stew had asked in broken English about Chen's family, showing genuine interest when Chen mentioned his parents' restaurant in California. Do you? Harrison pressed. Because I've seen good men lose themselves in here. Start thinking these people are just like us. Start forgetting what they did to our friends. But as February gave way to early March, Chen found it increasingly difficult to maintain his hatred. The local doctor, Dr. Anderson, treated prisoners and townspeople with equal care in the small clinic. The school teacher, Mrs. Holberg, had begun teaching basic Norwegian to interested prisoners, claiming it would help them communicate more effectively with the guards. Most unsettling of all was Sergeant Beck, the guard who'd first offered Chen coffee. Beck had lost his own brother in the fighting around Ridge 347, possibly to Chen's own rifle. Yet he continued to treat the American prisoners with professional courtesy, tinged with what seemed like genuine kindness. One evening, as Chen returned from his work detail, Beck approached him with something wrapped in brown paper. From my wife's kitchen, Beck said simply, handing over what proved to be a thick sandwich of homemade bread, cheese, and meat. She says soldiers should eat properly. Chen accepted the sandwich with trembling hands. Beck's wife had prepared food for the man who might have killed her brother-in-law. The bread was still warm, the meat carefully seasoned, the cheese sharp and rich. It tasted like love, like home, like everything he'd been fighting to protect. That night, Chen lay awake staring at the ceiling, Harrison's warnings echoing in his mind. But stronger than the warnings was the memory of that sandwich, the careful way Beck's wife had prepared it, the thought that somewhere in this small Norwegian town a woman had spent her evening cooking for her enemies because she believed it was the right thing to do. In the darkness of the barracks, Chen whispered his serial number over and over, as if the repetition could somehow restore the moral certainty that seemed to slip away a little more each day. When kindness comes from the hands of your enemies, which version of them do you choose to remember? The letter arrived in late March, carried by a Red Cross representative who moved through the camp like a gentle ghost, bringing news from a world that seemed increasingly distant. Chen's hands shook as he read his mother's careful script, her English precise, despite being her second language. The restaurant struggles without your father's help, she wrote. The rationing makes it hard to cook properly, but we manage. Mrs. Peterson came by yesterday. She wanted to thank you for what you did for her son before he was lost. She says you saved many lives that day in the mountains. Chen folded the letter carefully, but the words continued to echo. Peterson, the young private who died when their defensive line finally collapsed 3 hours after Chen's precision shooting had broken the enemy's assault coordination. Peterson, whose mother now credited Chen with saving lives. But sitting in this camp, sharing meals with the very people he'd been shooting at, the mathematics of survival seemed far more complex than his training had suggested. Harrison's reaction to his own letter was immediate and violent. His younger brother had been killed on the Western Front, and his parents' grief poured from the pages in accusations and demands for vengeance. "This is what we're fighting for," Harrison said, waving the letter with shaking hands. "This is what they took from us. Don't you dare let these people make you forget that." But Chen found himself thinking about Beck's wife, about Dr. Henderson treating a prisoner's infected wound with the same care he'd show a local child, about the schoolchildren who'd begun teaching him Norwegian curse words in exchange for American slang. The ideological pressure intensified when Major Phillips, a career officer captured 2 months earlier, began organizing what he called resistance meetings in the barracks after lights out. "We are soldiers," Phillips declared during one such gathering. "Our duty doesn't end with capture. We must maintain discipline, military bearing, and absolute loyalty to our cause. Any prisoner who collaborates, who shows sympathy to the enemy, weakens us all." Phillips's eyes had lingered on Chen during that speech, and Chen realized his growing comfort in the camp hadn't gone unnoticed. When Mrs. Holberg offered him advanced Norwegian lessons, Phillips was there to remind him that learning the enemy's language too well might be seen as collaboration. When Chen helped Dr. Anderson with inventory at the clinic, Phillips questioned whether American medical knowledge should be shared with enemy civilians. When Beck's wife sent another sandwich, Phillips wondered aloud whether accepting such gifts compromised their position as prisoners of war. The pressure reached its breaking point during a spring evening when Chen sat in the small camp library, reading a Norwegian book about local history. Phillips approached with several other prisoners in tow. "Sergeant Chen," Phillips said formally, "some of the men have expressed concerns about your adaptation to camp life." "I'm following orders, sir, working assigned details, maintaining discipline." "Are you?" "Because from where I sit, it looks like you're getting comfortable. Learning their language, accepting their food, treating their guards like old friends." Chen's face heated. "With respect, sir, I'm surviving, same as everyone else. Survival is one thing. Forgetting who we are is another." That night, Chen lay awake listening to the sounds of the Norwegian town beyond the fence. A mother calling her children in for supper. A radio playing American jazz from some distant station. The gentle rumble of the factory that employed half the town, producing goods for civilians and military alike. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. These people weren't the faceless monsters from his training films. They were just people going about their lives, trying to survive their own war with as much dignity as they could manage. And somehow, that realization felt more dangerous to Chen than any rifle shot had ever been. Can a man maintain his hatred when the enemy refuses to be hateful in return? April brought warmer weather and an unexpected visitor. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell from Allied Intelligence arrived for what she called routine prisoner welfare inspections. But Chen quickly realized her true mission was far more complex. Mitchell interviewed each prisoner privately, asking careful questions about treatment, camp conditions, and what she delicately termed ideological pressures. When she reached Chen, her demeanor shifted to something approaching professional curiosity. "Your case is interesting, Sergeant," she said, reviewing a thick file. "Reports suggest exceptional adaptation to camp life. Some might call that concerning." "I follow orders, ma'am. Work details, maintain discipline, comply with camp regulations. And yet you've learned conversational Norwegian in 6 weeks. You've been observed engaging in extended conversations with guards and local civilians. You've accepted gifts of food from enemy families." Chen felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on his shoulders. "I'm surviving, ma'am, using available resources to maintain physical and mental health." Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "Your shooting journal was analyzed by our ballistics team. Remarkable work, Sergeant. Those 17 hits you scored at Ridge 347 likely prevented a major breakthrough. You saved American lives. Yes, ma'am. The interesting thing is, our Norwegian contacts report that the enemy has analyzed your techniques as well. Professional respect among soldiers, they call it. Some of their marksmen have reportedly requested copies of your atmospheric adjustment notes. The revelation hit Chen like cold water. His meticulously recorded observations about wind patterns, temperature effects, and humidity corrections, notes he'd made while systematically killing Norwegian soldiers, were now being studied by their surviving comrades as educational material. How does that make you feel, Sergeant? Chen struggled for words. I did my job, ma'am. Following orders, protecting my unit. And now you're sharing meals with people who are using your professional knowledge to become better at killing your fellow soldiers. That evening, Dr. Anderson asked Chen to help with a difficult case in the clinic. A young Norwegian soldier, barely 18, had been injured in a training accident and needed emergency surgery. The local equipment was limited, and Anderson wanted Chen's help translating complex medical procedures he'd learned during his combat medic training. As they worked together to save the boy's life, Chen found himself caught in an impossible paradox. Here he was, using his military medical knowledge to help heal a soldier who might soon be deployed against American forces. The boy reminded him of Peterson, young, scared, far from home. "Good work," Anderson said quietly as they finished. "You have skilled hands for this. Your medical training is excellent. Just basic field medicine, sir." "No," Anderson shook his head. "This is more. You think like doctor, not just soldier. This boy lives because you knew what to do." Walking back to the barracks, Chen passed Beck's house and could smell dinner cooking, the familiar aroma of roasted meat and vegetables that had become a comforting part of his daily routine. Beck's wife waved from the window, a gesture so naturally friendly that Chen waved back before catching himself. Harrison was waiting when Chen entered the barracks. "Phillips is talking about formal charges when we get home," Harrison said without preamble. "Collaboration, giving aid and comfort to the enemy. I helped save a kid's life. You helped save an enemy soldier's life. There's a difference." "Is there?" Chen asked, and the question hung in the air between them like smoke. "Jesus, Chen, listen to yourself. Of course there is. That kid you saved tonight, in 6 months, he could be shooting at Americans, and you gave him the chance." That night, Chen stared at his reflection in the small mirror above his bunk. The face looking back at him seemed like a stranger, healthier than he'd been in months, more relaxed, but also more uncertain. His shooting journal lay in his footlocker, filled with precise calculations that had made him deadly at ranges exceeding 1-200 meters. Those same calculations were now helping Norwegian snipers improve their accuracy. His hands, which had once moved with mechanical precision across the Ruger Precision's adjustment systems, had tonight guided surgical instruments to save an enemy soldier's life. When the man in the mirror started asking questions you couldn't answer, which version of yourself did you trust? The shooting journal disappeared on a Tuesday morning in late April. Chen discovered its absence during the routine bunk inspection, the empty space in his footlocker hitting him like a physical blow. That notebook contained 3 years of accumulated knowledge, atmospheric calculations, wind pattern observations, temperature corrections, everything that had made him lethal at extreme range. But it was Captain Lars Hoyer who returned it, appearing at Chen's work detail with the brown leather journal tucked under his arm. "We made copies," Hoyer said simply, extending the original back to Chen. "Your notes on cold weather ballistics are remarkable. Our mountain warfare school will use them for training." Chen's hands trembled as he accepted the journal. "You're teaching Norwegian snipers to kill Americans using my research." "Yes," Hoyer replied with unsettling honesty. "Just as your forces use captured German techniques, Japanese tactics, Norwegian cold weather gear. This is war, Sergeant Chen. We adapt, we learn, we survive." That evening, Dr. Anderson approached Chen with an unusual request. The clinic had received a shipment of American medical supplies through a Red Cross exchange, and Anderson wanted Chen's help cataloguing the equipment. As they worked together in the clinic's supply room, Anderson spoke quietly. "I must tell you something, Marcus," he said, using Chen's first name for the first time. "Your journal, the ballistics notes, I read them when Captain Hoyer asked for medical consultation on combat effectiveness." Chen's stomach tightened. "Sir, these calculations, they describe 17 kills at range 347, yes, but also something else, trajectory adjustments to account for wind shift at 1430 hours, temperature corrections for increased range." Chen nodded slowly, not sure where this conversation was leading. "Marcus," Anderson said gently, "these notes show you deliberately aimed high for your final 3 shots. The trajectories would have passed over your targets, not through them." The revelation hit Chen like a sledgehammer. He'd blocked out the final moments of that engagement, the psychological exhaustion that had set in after 6 hours of systematic killing. But Anderson was right. His last 3 shots had been intentionally off target. While his conscious mind focused on tactical necessity, some deeper part of him had started pulling high, letting enemy soldiers escape rather than adding to his 17 confirmed kills. "Why would you do this?" Anderson asked. Chen's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know. I think you do. I think part of you, even in battle, recognized that these were men like you, soldiers far from home, trying to survive." That night, Chen sat alone in the library, staring at his shooting journal. The pages documented not just his technical expertise, but his gradual psychological breakdown under the weight of long-range killing. His handwriting grew less steady as the engagement progressed. His calculations became more complex, incorporating variables that didn't technically matter, wind shifts that wouldn't affect bullet trajectory, temperature corrections that were mathematically unnecessary. His subconscious had been looking for reasons to miss. When Beck approached the next morning with another sandwich from his wife, Chen found himself studying the man's face. The crow's feet around his eyes, the careful way he'd shaved despite the early hour, the small scar on his chin that might have come from childhood or combat. "My wife asks if you need warmer clothes," Beck said. "Spring here is still cold for Americans." "Beck," Chen said suddenly, "were you at Ridge 347 during the February engagement?" Beck's expression grew careful. "Yes, I was forward observer for artillery support. Then you called in the mortar strikes, the ones that hit our defensive line." "Yes." They stood facing each other in the pale morning light. 2 men who had spent an afternoon trying to kill each other, now sharing food prepared by a woman who had never seen either of their faces. "The shells that killed Peterson and Morrison," Chen continued, "you called those in." "I did my job," Beck said quietly. "Same as you." Chen took the sandwich with steady hands. The bread was still warm, the cheese perfectly aged, the meat tender and carefully seasoned. It tasted like forgiveness, though he wasn't sure who was forgiving whom. If you could taste the humanity in your enemy's kindness, would that make you a better soldier or a worse one? The notification came in June, delivered by the same Red Cross representative who had brought Chen's mother's letter months earlier. The war was ending. Prisoner exchanges had begun. Within weeks, Chen would be heading home, but home felt like a foreign concept now. As he packed his few possessions, Chen realized how much of himself he'd left in this small Norwegian town. His shooting journal went into his bag alongside a Norwegian phrase book Mrs. Holberg had given him, a small carved wooden figure Beck's son had made in shop class, and 3 letters from his mother he'd read so many times the paper had grown soft. The final meal in the mess hall was strangely ceremonial. Sergeant Beck appeared with a bottle of aquavit he'd been saving for special occasions, and Dr. Anderson brought homemade lefse that his mother had taught him to make. Even Colonel Erickson joined them, raising a toast to soldiers going home. "To survival with honor," Erickson said in careful English. "May you find peace in your memories." Harrison sat apart from the group, his face hard with disapproval. During their last private conversation, he'd made his position clear. When we get back, Chen, there will be questions about the language you learned, the friendships you made, the medical help you provided. I'd think carefully about how you answer those questions. But Philip's threatened formal charges never materialized. In the chaos of war's end, one sniper's complicated adaptation to prison camp life seemed like a minor administrative detail. Chen was processed, debriefed, and quietly transferred to a military hospital in England for evaluation. The psychiatrist was a kind man named Dr. Roberts, who asked careful questions about Chen's captivity experience. Any signs of ideological compromise, Stockholm Syndrome, collaboration with enemy forces? No, sir. I maintained military discipline throughout. Good. Your record shows exemplary service. 17 confirmed kills in extreme conditions, possibly preventing a major enemy breakthrough, the kind of shooting that wins wars. Dr. Roberts signed the evaluation forms with efficient strokes. Chen was cleared for return to active duty, then discharge, then civilian life. The official record would show that Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had served with distinction, been captured, survived imprisonment, and returned home without compromising his mission or his country. But late at night in the transport ship carrying him back to America, Chen found himself thinking about Beck's wife, cooking for her enemies, about Dr. Anderson saving lives regardless of uniform, about a young Norwegian soldier whose life he'd helped preserve. Most of all, he thought about his shooting journal and the 3 shots he'd deliberately pulled high, letting enemy soldiers live because some part of him had recognized their humanity even in the scope of his rifle. Years later, when ballistics experts studied the Ridge 347 engagement, they would describe Chen's performance as a case study in extreme-range precision shooting under adverse conditions. But Chen carried a different memory, 17 confirmed hits and 3 intentional misses that nobody would ever know about except one Norwegian doctor who'd read between the lines of technical data and seen a soldier's conscience fighting against his training. Back in California, Chen never spoke about the Norwegian camp. When asked about his captivity, he would say only that he'd been treated according to Geneva Convention standards and had maintained military discipline throughout his imprisonment. He never mentioned the sandwiches, the language lessons, or the medical procedures he'd helped perform. But sometimes, when cooking reminded him of home, Chen would remember the taste of Beck's wife's bread. Warm, carefully prepared, offered without condition to a man who had killed her neighbors. In those moments, he understood that the hardest truth about war wasn't the killing. It was learning to live with the unexpected mercy you'd both given and received. The shooting journal remained in his drawer for 40 years, its pages documenting the precise calculations that had made him deadly at ranges exceeding 200 meters. But Chen knew its real secret wasn't in the mathematics of killing. It was in those final 3 trajectories, the ones that proved even trained killers could choose mercy when they thought nobody was watching. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. Some memories are too dangerous to share, but too important to forget. Which memories would you carry in silence?